Well, the last 2 days were very exciting. The conversation was heartfelt, it was provocative, it was brave. There was a lot of trust, I think, building between the conversation partners. But what pulled everything together was a sense of the urgency of the conversation and people's impassioned commitment to theological education, to the formation of leaders that can really engage religious communities in our present-day world in ways that are sustaining. For me, as the president of a historically mainline Protestant seminary, it was very interesting to be, and a privilege to be invited to sit in a conversation that wasn't about being Protestant or being Christian, but was rather about what it means to be Jewish and Muslim in America, and to experience oneself, to know oneself to be a religious minority or a marginal religious experience in relation to the dominant Christian one. And I think it was a very interesting context for that conversation because it could focus on what are similar, I think, dynamics as I listened that Jews and Muslim experience is this challenge of assimilation. What does it mean to fit in America, in North America, but in the U.S., into a democratic conversation that you're deeply committed to as a participant in this grand experiment called America. And yet, how does one do that in such a way that the distinctiveness of one's own religious commitments isn't simply absorbed into the story of what it means to be an American? What I found interesting as I listened to that conversation was reflections on how, as a mainline Protestant, my experience of religious identity in this country is both similar and also very different. It's very different in the sense of I grew up in a world in which I knew in Oklahoma very few Jews and no Muslims whatsoever, and I thought of the world around me as a Christian world. In fact, I thought of it so much that way it was never even apparent to me where my Christianity stopped and my culture began, or where being an American stopped and being a Christian began. Having said that, I also grew up in a religious community that understood what it meant to be a Christian as being something that always resisted capitulation to the state. I was the child of a minister and very progressive, educated parents who during the 60s and the 70s were involved in civil rights activities, were involved in protests against Vietnam, and in both of those contexts experienced themselves and their Christian commitments putting them on the other side of the story about what it means to be an American that the state was constructing. And I grew up with a sense in a very classical Niebuhrian way that Christianity was at its best when it was not, in fact, the dominant, taken for granted religion, but could experience just how peculiar it is to be a Christian and to live in the world in ways that reflect a commitment to nonviolence, that reflect a commitment to openness, that reflects a commitment to care of the earth, that is not in concert, I think, with the dominant culture. I also have to say that as a mainline Protestant coming out of the Reformed tradition, when I listen to the conversation in the public square right now in the name of Christianity that's taking place by Green Party people or by Glenn Beck, by Focus on the Family, by a whole host of Christians advocating for family values in California, I feel this sense of I don't even quite know the word for it, but the sense that somebody has absconded with my faith, that what they articulate is is not what I believe. It's not the God that I worship. And those are not the commitments that ground my life as a minister, as a human being, as a woman, as an American, as a president. So that was all interesting to see both where coming out of the dominant culture draws different kinds of lines and where there are actually echoes of similarity.